Hi, AJ Hartley here, novelist, Shakespeare professor, fan of many things connected to Japan. And if you've been watching this channel recently, you'll know that I just got back from about a month traveling around in Japan. And I thought that rather than simply make a video about my trip, I made a lot of short videos while I was there and posted them as little postcards. There's a separate playlist for those. That I thought I would make a video for people who are thinking about going to Japan to sort of discuss some of the logistics and some of the things that you might need to know, things that might be helpful. Now, if you already live in Japan, if you're either a foreign resident or a Japanese person, then most of this is going to be, self-evident and not particularly interesting. But hopefully, there'll be enough stuff here for people who may be planning a trip that they will find it useful. And if I have a lot of stuff, I might break this video up into a couple of separate things. But I wanted to talk about some basic logistics. I should say, also that I used to live in Japan, but that was a long time ago. So when I go back primarily as a tourist. I've been back many times since I used to live there. So there are going to be people online who do live in Japan, particularly foreigners who live in Japan, who will be in some ways better guides to this kind of thing than me. But what I would say is it's actually useful to have insight from somebody who doesn't live in Japan as to how to get around, because people who live there take certain things for granted and they forget that there are certain things that you have to think about if you're not used to being there. So for what that's worth, this is why I'm doing this. And before we go any further, let me just sort of say, part of the question always is, should we go to Japan? And the answer is yes, you absolutely should. If you have the opportunity, if you have the resources, you have any interest at all, you should totally go. It's one of my favorite places in the world. There is nowhere like it. Literally, there is nowhere like it. It blends a sense of a lived history, a sort of omnipresent tradition, alongside a cutting-edge, new, exciting culture. There's nowhere that feels as safe, where the food is fantastic, the extraordinary things to see that you cannot see anywhere else in the world, but also just the culture, the people, everything about it is so great. I love it. So yes, you should go. That's the short version. It's not flawless. It has its issues. It has its problems. But yes, you should totally go. All right, how would you do that? Let's talk. So first, what do we need to have with us? Obviously, depending on where you're coming from, you're going to need a passport. You may need a visa depending on where you're coming from. If you have a UK or US passport, you don't for, I'm not sure, maybe 3 months. I'll check how long you can be there for without a visa. Japan is a comparatively easy country to get to. I should say that at the moment, it's also a fairly cheap country to be in. That did not used to be the case at all, and I suspect that as the Japanese economy improves, as some experts think it will, the costs will go up. At the moment, it's a really good time to be there. Things that are surprisingly reasonable, especially when you factor in the exchange rate. Cost us about $1,600 to fly. You might be able to get it a little cheaper than that. Obviously, I'm flying from Charlotte. I flew via Minneapolis in one direction and Detroit in the other. I flew Delta. Whatever gets you there. And you can fly into either Haneda or Narita in Tokyo. If you're thinking of going to basing your trip around the southern part of the country, around Kyushu, you might consider flying into somewhere like Seoul, South Korea, and then flying across from there. But most of the sort of standard internet travel sites like Expedia, Travelocity, will give you those kind of options. But it does kind of depend on where you think you're going to be. As you will know, again, if you kept an eye on some of those videos, I tend to travel around a lot. We always do. So flying in and out of Tokyo and then moving around a lot in Japan by train is kind of my default position, and I'll talk some more about that. It's a lot, depending on where you're coming from, of course. If you're coming from the US or the UK or other parts of Western Europe, it's a long flight. You're going to spend at least 13 hours in the air, maybe more. For me, coming from Charlotte, it's about the Pacific leg is about 13 hours, but to get there is another 2. I flew from Minneapolis, so that's a couple of hours for me to get there. Then it's a 13-hour flight, but of course you've got layover time, you've got check-in time. I think all told, the return journey took about 22 hours door to door, something like that. So it's a long time. So one of the things to bear in mind is that, of course, when you arrive, you're going to be jet lagged one way or another. I don't know about you, I don't sleep very well on planes. Sometimes I don't sleep at all on planes. So for the first day that I'm there, I usually stay fairly local. If we have a lot of travel to do, we'll make sure that we have a night in Tokyo before we set off on a major train journey or whatever. So this is something to bear in mind. And the jet lag is complicated further by the time difference, right? So for me, again, it's a 13-hour difference. Japan is 13 hours ahead of where I live. So your body has no idea what the hell's going on, You feel like it's nighttime, you arrive, and it's the middle of the day. The trick, I think, is to get on local time as quickly as possible. And if that means staying up and then going to bed at night, that's usually what I try to do. I might take a power nap, but you don't want to stay on your home time. It'll just mess you up. In terms of stuff that you need, other than a passport, you will need a phone. Now, you can get a Japanese SIM card for your phone, and you can either order that in advance or you can get it at the airport. And there are useful things about having a Japanese phone. In the video that I made about the Hyakuman Rock Festival in Kanazawa, I talked about the impossibility of buying tickets for that rock festival if I didn't have a specifically Japanese phone. So in that case, we absolutely needed it. Most of the time, you don't. There are not going to be many things that absolutely necessitate you having a Japanese phone number, right? You can manage with your US or UK phone, whatever you're using. You will need some sort of service plan, however, because the phones are an extremely useful way of navigating, figuring out what trains you need to be on, and so on, using Google Maps and Apple Maps, which function slightly differently. Apple Maps is more useful for directions. Google Maps handle Japanese addresses better. But, in order to do that, you need a data plan. There are other things, like, for example, when we wanted to use a shuttle bus to get us back to the airport, you can only book that by using a QR code and booking it online. So if you don't have a working phone, that's going to be a problem. There were a couple of other things where that came up, where the only way to do something was online. So so make sure you have a working phone. As far as travel is concerned, this is going to require you to obviously to plan somewhat in advance. And you can plan in a lot of ways. I always get a guidebook. I don't know how many Japanese guidebooks I have at this point. And to be honest, I don't think I would really recommend it. We always get one because you think, well, it will at least give us opening hours, a sense of what time things are functioning and what has changed since the last time we were there. But most guidebooks are not that great. A lot of the stuff that I particularly value is not in them at all. And of course, most guidebooks are to the entire country. So there's a sort of smattering of information about Japan as a whole. And nobody's going to do Japan as a whole. You're going to be in a certain number of places. So, you might be able to function perfectly well just using the internet. And you don't need a guidebook per se. But again, if you are going to rely on the internet, you are going to need a working phone. This is self-evident, but, I would do it. Japan is not a very credit card driven economy. It's still surprisingly cash centered. There are processes at work at the moment in Japan to try and change this for lots of good reasons. But for the most part, people carry a lot of cash. Now, when I say carry, I don't mean carry it with you all the time. Japan is an extremely safe country to be in. So, leaving money and things like that in hotel rooms is generally very safe. And of course, most hotel rooms have safes or some sort of concierge who can store stuff for you at the front desk. But I would take cash. In Japanese yen, obviously don't expect to pay with anything other than Japanese yen. But assume that most places will not accept credit cards. And even some places that do accept credit cards will not accept American or other non-Japanese credit cards. Most of the time, you're going to go by cash. And of course, you can draw cash out at ATMs and things like that if you need to. But it's kind of like the phone thing. I would make sure that your bank knows where you're going to be so that you can use your own credit card where you have that opportunity, and you know what ATMs to use so that you can draw Japanese money out from your accounts. Try to estimate what you're going to spend money on, how much you're going to spend while you're there, and get Japanese money from your local bank before you leave, and then budget accordingly. And there is something, quite valuable. I was talking to my wife about this, about using cash in Japan, because it means that you are much more aware of how much you're actually spending. With credit cards, it's just magic, right? You can pay and pay and pay and pay and have no idea unless you're constantly going and checking your account. I wouldn't carry your entire trip money on your person all the time because that's asking for trouble. But in addition to living in Japan, I've been many, many times. I've never felt unsafe at all. A couple of final things about money. Because the economy is so driven by cash, you don't have a problem with going to a convenience store and paying for a small number of things with a large bill, with a 5,000 or 10,000 yen note. It's considered normal. And any machine requiring you to pay for a ticket or admission to something or whatever will take cash, both notes and coins. Likewise, vending machines. They'll take everything. And they're really easy. They sort the change for you. It comes right out. It's super easy to use. So using cash is easier in many ways than using credit cards. If we're going to talk about money, then let's actually talk about it. Let's talk about how much a trip to Japan costs. So, of course, the largest expense is likely to be the airfare. I'm going to talk about travel inside Japan in the next video, but let's do a quick overview now so that you get a sense of how to budget for this stuff. That flight for us this time cost like $1,600 per person round trip. So that's your biggest expense right there. And so, it makes sense, I think, if you go to Japan to stay for as long as you realistically can or want to, because, there's a good likelihood that the first couple of days you're going to be dragging, you know. And because it's so expensive and so time consuming just to get there, you don't want to do it for a couple of days. I did that once. I went to the World Cup when it was hosted in Japan and South Korea, and I flew to Japan and went to Shizuoka to watch England play in the quarterfinal against Brazil, and we lost 2-1. And I was literally in the air longer than I was on the ground. And when I got home, I thought I was going to die, because it was like literally a 2-day trip. And it was really, really hard. So, if you can avoid it, don't do that. So let's think. So let's say you're going for 2 weeks, $1,600 round trip airfare. Accommodation per night, I'm going to talk about accommodation in another video. I would say on average about $150 a night, depending on where you're staying. So 14 days times $150 is a little over $2,000. Add to that about $400 for a JR pass, which I'll talk about in the next video when I'm talking about travel inside Japan. So far we're up to $4,100. This is for one person. Meals. If you do 3 meals a day in restaurants, it's going to cost you a little bit more. Usually I got breakfast at convenience stores, Lawson's, Family Mart, 7-Eleven, that have a good selection of stuff. That way I can take it to the hotel, keep it in the fridge, and eat it in the morning. That's not going to cost you more than a few hundred yen. Say you have a proper lunch and a dinner. I would say most meals, I would say about 2,000 yen. So let's say a total of 5,000 yen per day. 5,000 yen is going to be about $40. Again, that's for 14 days. $560. So we're now looking at 4,100. Let's call it, it's a 46.60. And then, minor expenses, spending money, souvenirs. That's easily going to take you up to 5,000 for a 2-week trip. Now that's for one person. But if you go up, if it's a 2-person or 3-person trip, the only thing that's actually going to go up is the per diem food and the airfare, unless you're going to add a hotel room. But for us, if it was just me and my wife, or me and my wife and my son, we still share a room, and we just sort of put up with it for the 2 weeks. He could have his own room, I guess, but we don't tend to do that because we're cheap. Okay, so there you go. But we're looking at something like $5,000 a person for 2 weeks. But as I say, if there's 2 of you, that will go up some, but not a massive amount. I would say, I think, for 3 of us, for 3 weeks, including souvenirs and all kinds of other little bits of things here and there, we probably spent something like 12 grand, which is, a decent amount of money, but it was a big trip. It was a big trip. So, I do think it's doable. The other thing is that, and I'll talk about this when I'm talking about accommodation, but you can book, I would recommend that you book your accommodation from your home country before you go, and you pay for it, right? So often with Travelocity and things like that, you have the option of paying now or paying in the country when you get there. Don't do that. Pay now, assuming that the exchange rate is decent. Pay when you book, and then you don't have to worry about that. then you don't have to budget for that. You don't have to carry the money, right? Likewise, this is one of the advantages of paying for something like the JR Pass, the Rail Pass, which I'll talk about in the next video, in advance. Because then the only thing that you have to carry is money for basically food and drink and fun stuff and souvenirs, you know, museums and things like that that are going to cost, you know, a bit here and there. But you're not having to carry cash. You're not having to worry about the expense of the hotels and the rail fares. So you pay for it in the same way that you would pay for the flight out, and it spreads the load financially, right? So you don't have a massive bill for 12 grand. You have it spread out over the period over which you booked stuff and then the stuff that you did in country. And it's financially a lot easier to take. So that's all I'm going to do for now. I'm going to do future videos on travel in Japan, on accommodation, on basic conduct and behavior for foreigners, on food, and then I'll probably do a series of videos on places that I think are worth visiting that you might not have considered. So I'll be making these over the next couple of weeks, and I'll probably try to keep each one down to 15, 20 minutes, something like that, so they don't become overburdensome. Is that a word? Well, it is now. All right, that's all. For now, thanks. Please like, comment, subscribe, and check out my Patreon page. Thank you, my patrons. Check out my merchandise. Check out my books, including my upcoming novel, Hideki Smith, Demon Queller, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks.